My name is Amy, and I'm 35 years old. I've been married for 5 years, but recently my life has taken a sharp, unexpected turn. My husband, who once stood by my side, proposed something I never thought I'd hear: divorce. It wasn't a gentle conversation either. He delivered the news coldly, almost as if it was a minor decision, like picking out a shirt. I sat there stunned, replaying his words in my mind. This is the man who once held me close when I felt alone in the world, and now he was tossing me aside. I had spent years trying to make our marriage work, despite the cracks that had started to show. We had always dreamed of having children, but that dream never materialized. Over time, his kindness became overshadowed by his controlling nature, and I began to see the man I married slowly disappear. Now his detachment seemed complete, and I realized I no longer recognized him. Still, I hadn't seen this coming. In the beginning, we were happy, or at least I believed we were. We married with the hope of building a life together, complete with a family of our own. But after a few years, when we struggled to have children, the atmosphere in our home changed. We explored the idea of fertility treatments, but my husband's opinion was that we should let nature take its course. Even if we can't have children, we still have each other, he said. And for a while, those words comforted me. I thought we were on the same page, trying to stay positive, but behind his supportive words, I could sense something shifting in him. Over time, he became distant, his once tender nature hardening. Then, his parents died, one after the other, and the grief weighed heavily on him. Instead of grieving together, he pulled away, retreating further into himself. Things became even more strained when his brother lost his job. The bond between my husband and his younger brother was strong, and I could tell it hit him hard. I tried to comfort him, offering to help his brother in any way we could, but my husband wasn't having it. Instead of appreciating my suggestion, he snapped at me. "What can you do?" he asked coldly. "You're just an outsider in this." His words stung more than I let on. How could I be an outsider in my own marriage? It felt like a slap in the face, and it was the first time he had ever spoken to me with such disdain. This wasn't the man who had comforted me during my hardest times, who had once looked at me with admiration. That moment marked a turning point in our relationship, though I didn't fully understand it at the time. As the days passed, the coldness between us only grew worse. I tried to salvage what was left of our relationship. I thought maybe if I was patient, if I waited for him to get through this rough patch, things would improve. But his attitude continued to worsen. He became more critical of me, comparing me unfavorably to his brother's wife. "She manages her home perfectly. Why can't you do the same?" he would say, with an edge to his voice that I wasn't used to hearing. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed like nothing I did was enough. He stopped talking to me altogether, and when he did speak, it was with bitterness. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, and I found myself dreading the moments he came home from work. It became clear to me that this wasn't just a phase. He had already made up his mind about our future, but I hadn't realized it yet. His plan was already in motion. One morning, I woke up to the sound of my husband cleaning out his things. This was unusual. Normally, he was too tired or too preoccupied with work to focus on the house, but today, he was packing up old items, sorting through what was necessary and what wasn't. I asked him what he was doing, and his response left me speechless. "We're moving. I've decided to give this house to my brother and his wife," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my house, one I had inherited from my grandfather. I reminded him of that fact, but it didn't seem to matter. He brushed off my concerns and told me to get ready to move out. It was then that I realized how little he valued our life together. He wasn't just trying to control me, he was trying to erase me from his life completely. It all came crashing down that day. As I watched my husband coldly toss aside our life together, I felt something inside me shift. The man who had once been my greatest ally had turned into a stranger, someone who no longer cared about our marriage or about me. That night, I went into his study to clean, and what I found there changed everything. On his desk was a completed divorce application. I stared at it, unable to move, unable to process the fact that he had been planning this behind my back. My heart felt heavy with the realization that our marriage had been over for him long before he ever told me. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't the life I wanted anymore, and staying with him was no longer an option. With a sense of calm that surprised even me, I picked up the divorce papers, signed them, and placed them in an envelope. The next morning, I planned to file them at City Hall, ending the marriage that had turned into a prison. That night, I confronted my husband. "This house isn't yours to give," I told him. "It belonged to my grandfather, and I inherited it before we even got married. You've never paid a dime in property taxes, so tell me, how exactly do you plan to give it to your brother?" My words left him stunned. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, stammering as he tried to come up with an answer. It was clear he had never thought this far ahead. His arrogance had blinded him to the reality of the situation. I showed him the divorce papers, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of power in the relationship. I was no longer the one being controlled. My husband begged me to reconsider, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The man who had once been my protector had turned into someone I could barely recognize, and there was no going back. I submitted the divorce papers the next morning, and just like that, it was over. My husband moved out of the house shortly after, leaving behind the life we had built together. I thought I would feel sadness, maybe even regret, but instead, I felt relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The house, once filled with tension, was now peaceful. It was my space again, and I could begin to rebuild my life without him. But the story didn't end there. A few months later, I ran into him again, and what he said left me speechless. I was leaving a meeting with a real estate agent when I saw him standing outside, waiting for me. His appearance startled me. He looked disheveled and worn out, a shadow of the man he used to be. "Amy, wait!" he called out, and though I wanted nothing to do with him, something in his voice made me stop. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone desperate. Against my better judgment, I agreed to hear him out. What he told me was both shocking and ridiculous. He blamed me for everything that had gone wrong in his life since our divorce. His brother had cut ties with him, he had been making mistakes at work, and he had even been injured in a fire at his new apartment. "It's all your fault," he said bitterly. "Ever since we got married, nothing but bad things have happened." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He actually thought I was responsible for all the misfortune in his life. He had always been self-centered, but this was a new low. I reminded him that his parents had been sick before we were married, that his brother's job loss had nothing to do with me, and that the fire was caused by his own carelessness. But he wouldn't listen. His resentment had consumed him, twisting reality to fit his narrative. I realized then that this wasn't about me at all, it was about him. He couldn't accept responsibility for his own actions, so he blamed me instead. As he continued to rant, I felt a sense of pity for him, but I also knew that I had made the right decision to leave. He was a broken man, and nothing I could say or do would change that. Eventually, I walked away, leaving him standing there, still muttering about his misfortunes. I had moved on, and I wasn't going to let him drag me back into his chaos. A week later, I received a call from his brother, the one he had claimed to be supporting by giving away our house. "Amy, I just wanted to thank you for everything," his brother said. "I heard what happened, and I want you to know that my wife and I had no idea about the plan to take your house. That was all my brother's doing." His words confirmed what I had suspected all along. My ex-husband had acted on his own, driven by his need for control and validation. His brother was kind and understanding, and I couldn't help but feel relieved that he hadn't been part of the scheme. As time went on, I rebuilt my life. I rented out the house and moved to a new place, cutting all ties with my ex-husband. The past was behind me, and I was ready to move forward. I had always thought that my marriage was the foundation of my life, but in the end, it was only a chapter. I was 35, still young, and full of possibilities. My future was my own to shape, and I no longer needed anyone else's approval to live the life I wanted. As for my ex-husband, I heard through mutual friends that he continued to spiral, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. But that was no longer my concern. I had finally found peace, and I wasn't looking